The morning Lillian Brooks buried her husband, the sky cracked open with a cold so sharp it felt like God himself was punishing her, and she knew, standing over that frozen mound of earth with nothing but a wool shawl and a breaking heart, that the real suffering had not yet begun. It was the autumn of 1878, and the Wyoming territory stretched out around her homestead like a vast, indifferent ocean of sage and dry grass. The nearest town, a small cluttered settlement called Harlan Creek, sat 12 miles east through a pass that could become impassable within a single afternoon's worth of snowfall. Lillian's husband, Thomas Brooks, had died not from violence or outlaws or any of the dramatic things that people back east imagined when they thought of the West. He had died from a fever that crept up on him over the course of 2 weeks, a fever that sweated him dry, and then simply took him one gray Tuesday morning, while Lillian held his hand and talked to him about the spring planting they would do together. He had stopped breathing so quietly that she had kept talking for almost a full minute before she understood. She was 26 years old. She had 160 acres of homestead land, a barn, a small but sturdy cabin, 2 milk cows, a handful of chickens, a horse named Clover, and a root cellar that Thomas had insisted on filling before he took to his bed. She also had, pressed into her chest like a burning coal, a grief so enormous that she could not look at it directly for very long without feeling like she might simply fold into the ground and never get up again. She did not fold. That was the thing about Lillian Brooks that people in Harlan Creek would come to speak of quietly, with a particular kind of reverence usually reserved for people who had done something extraordinary. She did not fold. She squared her shoulders the very same afternoon she buried Thomas, walked back into that cabin, and started a fire. She made herself a pot of coffee, sat down at the small table where Thomas used to read aloud from the almanac every evening, and she wrote out a list of everything that needed to be done before the first hard freeze. The first winter was brutal, 1878 sliding into 1879, with a ruthlessness that left the whole territory staggered. Temperatures dropped so low that the ink in Lillian's writing bottle froze, solid more than once. She lost 2 of her chickens to the cold despite every effort, and Clover developed a cough that frightened her so deeply she spent 3 consecutive nights sleeping in the barn with a horse, wrapped in every blanket she owned. She ate simply and carefully, rationing the stores in her cellar with the mathematical precision of someone who understood in her bones that every jar of preserved beans and every pound of dried corn was the difference between her living and her dying. She made it through. Thin and exhausted and haunted by Thomas's absence in every quiet corner of the cabin, but alive. When spring came, it felt less like a victory and more like a temporary reprieve. She replanted the garden, traded for more chickens in town, and tried not to think too much about the fact that she had to do it all again. The second winter came harder. There was a blizzard in December of 1879 that buried her cabin to the windowsills and kept her trapped inside for 11 days. She had been preparing for it, though. She was smarter by then, more ruthless in her preparations, more calculating. She had stacked firewood 6 feet high along the north wall of the cabin. She had put up enough preserved food to last a siege. She had even fashioned a rope line from her cabin door to the barn, so she could navigate the distance in a whiteout without losing her way. She had heard stories of settlers found frozen only 100 feet from their own front doors, disoriented by the blinding sameness of a full blizzard, and she was not going to be one of those stories. Still, those 11 days alone inside the cabin nearly broke something inside her that she wasn't sure had a name. It was not her will. Her will was iron by that point. It was something softer, something that lived in the part of her that used to laugh freely and reach for Thomas's hand across the dinner table without thinking. That part went quiet during those 11 days in a way that worried her, even though she did not let herself examine it too closely. There was no time for that kind of examination. There was only the next fire to build, the next meal to cook, the next day to survive. She made it through the second winter. Spring of 1880 found her garden doubled in size, her chicken flock rebuilt, and a new arrangement with old Ezra Potts down the road, 6 miles south, where she would check on him every 2 weeks, and he would let her know if he heard anything coming from town that she needed to be aware of. It was a practical arrangement, the kind that the West demanded of people who wanted to survive it. The third winter, the one that rolled in with the gray skies of December 1880, was the one that finally showed Lillian what her own limits were. Not because she wasn't prepared. She was better prepared than she had ever been. But a fox got into the chicken coop in early November and killed every one of her hens, and then Clover's cough returned worse than before. And in January, a section of her roof gave way under the weight of an ice accumulation that she had not been able to clear in time. She patched it as best she could with boards and canvas and a grim determination that would have impressed anyone who witnessed it, but the cold still got in, and she spent 2 months sleeping close to the fire with everything she owned piled on top of her, burning through her wood stores at twice the rate she had planned. She traded for new chickens in the spring. She fixed the roof properly with lumber she hauled herself from town on Clover's back. She replanted. She survived. But when she sat down one evening in June of 1881, in the long, quiet light of a summer evening that Thomas would have loved, she allowed herself to truly count the cost of the last 3 years. She was 29 years old and felt considerably older. She was strong, yes, genuinely physically strong in a way she had not been when she first came west as a young bride. But she was also alone in a way that had calcified inside her, settled into something permanent and heavy, like a stone lodged against her ribs. She thought about going back east, back to her sister in Missouri. She thought about it for exactly one evening, and then she put the thought away. This land was hers. Thomas had died for it, in the most mundane and devastating way possible, and she had bled for it and frozen for it, and she was not giving it up. But she was also honest enough with herself to acknowledge that she could not keep doing this exactly as she had been doing it. Something had to change. What she did not expect was that the change would ride in on a bay horse named Augustus one morning in late August of 1881, in the form of Raymond Bancroft. She was mending the fence line on the eastern edge of her property when she first saw him, and her initial thought was not a charitable one. A stranger on horseback, coming across her land without invitation, triggered every instinct she had carefully developed over 3 years of being a woman alone on the frontier. She set down her tools and walked back toward the cabin at a measured pace, not running, because she had learned that running communicated panic, and she was not in the habit of communicating anything she didn't mean to. By the time the horseman reached hailing distance, she was standing on her porch with her posture straight and her expression neutral. He stopped his horse at what she recognized as a respectful distance, the kind of distance that said he understood he was approaching someone else's home and was not going to assume himself welcome. She noted that. She noted it the way she noted everything, with the careful attention of someone who had learned that small details could matter enormously. He was a tall man, broad across the shoulders in a way that came from work rather than accident. Somewhere in his mid-30s, she guessed, with dark hair that needed a cut and eyes that were a particular shade of brown that the morning light made look almost amber. He wore a battered hat and trail-dusty clothes, and he had an honest face, which was not always as reassuring as people seemed to think, but it was something. "Morning," he said. His voice was calm and unhurried, with a slight roughness to it that suggested he didn't waste words unnecessarily. "I'm looking for the Brooks place. I was told in town it was this direction." "You found it," Lillian said. "I'm Lillian Brooks. What is it you want?" He swung down from his horse in one easy motion and took his hat off, which she also noted. "My name is Raymond Bancroft. I was a friend of your husband's, or as much of a friend as 2 men can be who only met a handful of times. We crossed paths on the cattle drive up from Texas 2 years before he passed. He was a good man. I heard about what happened to him when I came through Harlan Creek last week, and I wanted to offer my condolences. I know it's been some time." Lillian studied him. The The grief for Thomas was a familiar weight that she had learned to carry, and a stranger's condolences could still catch her off guard sometimes, land in unexpected places. But she kept her face composed. "Thank you," she said. "How do you come to be in Harlan Creek?" "I'm looking to settle," he said. "I've been driving cattle since I was 16 years old, and I'm tired of living on the back of a horse. I was hoping to find land. The man at the land office told me there's a section available 3 miles north of here." Lillian knew the section he meant. It had belonged to a family called the Hendersons who had given up and gone back east after 2 hard winters with too many children and not enough luck. "That land is available," she said. "It's decent land if you know what you're doing with it." He looked at her steadily. "I know what I'm doing with land," he said simply, without bragging. "I grew up on a farm in Kentucky before the trail took me. I know how to read soil and I know how to read weather." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Would you like some coffee?" It was not an impulsive offer. Lillian Brooks did not make impulsive offers. But she had been watching him for several minutes now, reading him the way the West had taught her to read everything. And what she read was a man who said what he meant and meant what he said, which was rarer than gold dust in her experience. "I would appreciate that very much," Raymond Bancroft said. He tied Augustus to her hitching post and followed her inside, and he was careful, she noticed, to wait at the door until she gestured him in. He sat where she indicated and looked around the cabin with the straightforward curiosity of someone who was seeing a life rather than a building. She watched him take in the shelves she had built herself along the north wall, the kitchen garden she had planted in the window boxes, the rope coiled by the door that she used for the barn line in winter. His eyes moved across all of it, and she could see him understanding it, understanding what it represented, and she respected that he didn't say anything foolish. She poured the coffee and they talked for an hour, which surprised her, because she was not in the habit of talking for an hour to anyone. They talked about the land, about the weather patterns in the territory, about what the soil needed and what it wouldn't tolerate. Raymond asked intelligent questions and listened to the answers with his full attention, and Lillian found herself answering with more detail than she had intended to give, because he seemed genuinely interested and genuinely capable of understanding what she told him. He told her he was 34 years old. He told her he had saved carefully over 12 years of cattle driving and had enough put by to buy the land and build a proper structure. He told her he had no family left to speak of, that his parents were both gone, and his one brother had died in a cattle accident years before. He said this last thing without self-pity, just as a fact, and she understood that kind of saying it as fact, understood it from the inside. When he stood up to leave, he shook her hand, which she appreciated more than a bow would have been, because it acknowledged her as a person rather than a courtesy. "Thank you for the coffee, Mrs. Brooks," he said, "and for the information about the land. It's a fair piece of work, that section," she said. "The house that was there is in poor condition. You'll need to rebuild most of it before winter." He looked at her with an expression that was direct without being aggressive. "I know," he said. "I've got time if I start immediately." "You should start immediately," she said, and meant it. The summer was already half gone, and the Wyoming territory did not offer second chances about winter preparations. He bought the land that same week. She watched from her fence line, 3 days after their coffee conversation, as he rode out to the Henderson section with a cart full of lumber and tools. She told herself it was curiosity that made her watch. It was partly true. Over the following weeks, Lillian found herself in Raymond's company more often than she had strictly planned for. It began practically. He needed to know where the nearest water source was on his section, and she had already scouted it, having considered that land herself in better days. She rode over to show him and ended up staying 2 hours helping him diagnose a problem with the foundation he was laying. He came to her place 3 days later with a section of fence post that had blown off his wagon and landed near her gate. And while he was there, he noticed that one of her support beams on the barn was looking worrisome, and he pointed it out with the same matter-of-fact directness he had brought to everything. "That's going to cause you trouble," he said, looking up at the beam with his head tilted. "Might hold another season, but I wouldn't bet on it." "I know," she said. "I've been meaning to address it." "I could help with that," he said, "if you'd allow it." She almost said no because saying no to offers of help had become reflexive, had become part of the armor she wore. But she looked at the beam and then looked at the coming season and let herself be honest. "I would allow it," she said. "I can offer you dinner in return." The arrangement was simple and practical, the kind of arrangement the frontier built naturally between neighbors, but something else was building inside it that was less simple and less strictly practical, though neither of them said anything about it for a long time. She learned things about him in pieces, the way you learned things about a person when you worked alongside them and watched them operate in the world. She learned that he was methodical but not inflexible, that he could revise a plan when the situation required it without getting frustrated or stubborn. She learned that he was genuinely kind to animals, that Augustus responded to him with a trust that horses only gave to people who had earned it. She learned that he had an unexpected sense of humor that arrived quietly, without announcement, in the form of a dry observation that took her a moment to catch. And when she did catch it, she found herself laughing with a freedom that she hadn't felt in a long time. He learned things about her too. She could see him learning her, with the same careful attention he brought to reading the land. He learned not to approach her with suggestions in a way that sounded like criticism. He learned that she needed to come to a decision in her own time, and that if he pushed, she would go still and quiet in a way that was not agreeable. He learned that she was fiercely competent, and that acknowledging that competence directly was more welcome than any number of gentler compliments. There was an afternoon in early September when they were both working on his roof, because she had offered to help him finish it before the weather turned, and she was better than him at navigating the steep pitch on the east side. She had better balance, which he acknowledged without embarrassment. They were working in a comfortable silence that had developed between them over weeks of this kind of company, and she was reaching to place a shingle and her foot slipped on the smooth wood. She caught herself, grabbed the ridge beam, steadied, but her heart was hammering. Raymond was 2 feet to her left and he moved immediately, one hand coming to her elbow, not gripping, just there, just present, a steadying contact that asked nothing and offered everything. "All right," he said, and the word was soft enough that only she could have heard it. "All right," she said, and meant it. He let go of her elbow when she found her footing, did not make a production of it, did not suggest she come down from the roof or take a rest, just went back to his own work. But the warmth of his hand on her elbow stayed with her through the rest of the afternoon and into the evening, long after she had ridden home, in a way that she chose not to examine directly but could not quite ignore. The summer evenings were growing shorter. She could feel the season turning, the particular quality of the light changing, in a way that she had come to read like a language after 3 years. There was a conversation she had with herself in the last days of September, sitting on her porch after a long day, watching the first stars come out over the ridgeline. She was honest with herself in a way that she had learned to be because the alternative, the comfortable lie, was a luxury that the frontier didn't offer. She was falling in love with Raymond Bancroft. Or perhaps love was too neat a word for what was happening, which felt more like something long sealed was slowly opening. The way a field looks after the thaw when things you forgot were buried there start to push up through the soil. She did not know what to do with this information, so she did what she always did with things she couldn't immediately act on. She set it aside and kept working. It was in the first week of October that Raymond said the thing that changed everything between them. He had come over in the late afternoon to return a tool he had borrowed, a particular chisel she had inherited from Thomas's kit, and she had offered him dinner because she was cooking anyway, and it seemed wasteful not to. They ate at the small table, talking comfortably about his plans for the spring planting, and then she was clearing the dishes, and he was sitting with his coffee cup in his hands looking out the window at the darkening sky, and he said it. "Lillian." Her name in his voice had a quality she had come to recognize without letting herself name it. "I want to talk to you about something." She turned from the wash basin and looked at him. "Then talk," she said, because she had learned that waiting people out was often more productive than prompting them. He set his coffee cup down and looked at her directly, which was his habit, the directness of his gaze always slightly startling even though she had been in his company for weeks. "You survived 3 winters out here on your own," he said. "3 hard ones. I know that because I talked to Ezra Potts and I talked to a few people in town, and what they told me made me understand very clearly what kind of person you are." She waited. "You will not survive a 4th one solo," he said. The words landed quietly, but they were not quiet words. She felt them in her chest, not as an insult, because his tone held none of the condescension she might have expected from someone else saying those words. He said it the way he would say that a beam was going to fail or that the frost was coming early. He said it as an honest assessment of a real situation, from someone who had been watching and calculating and was not willing to pretend he hadn't been. She felt something flare up in her, the instinctive resistance that 3 years of independence had built into her like a structural element. "I've managed 3 winters," she said. "I know what I'm doing." "You do," he said. "You know exactly what you're doing and you're better at it than most men I've known. That's not what I'm saying." He paused, and she could see him choosing his words with unusual care for someone who was generally economical with them. "What I'm saying is that last winter took something out of you that didn't come back in the summer. I can see it. The roof. The chickens. You were close, Lillian. Closer than you were comfortable with." She turned fully from the wash basin and looked at him, and the protest died in her throat because he was not wrong. He was not wrong, and she had known it, and she had not let herself say it. And having it said aloud by someone who said it from concern, rather than judgment, was almost more than she could manage to hold steadily. "What are you suggesting?" she said, because she needed him to say it plainly. He held her gaze. "I'm suggesting you don't have to do it alone," he said. "I'm your neighbor. I intend to be here for a long time. I've spent weeks working alongside you, and I think you know I'm not a man who says things he doesn't mean." He paused again. "I'm also going to tell you something else, and I want you to understand that I'm not saying it to pressure you or to change anything that you don't want changed. I'm saying it because I think you deserve to know it." "Say it then," she said. "I care about you," he said, "a great deal. In a way that I haven't been able to set aside since about the 3rd day I knew you, and I've tried, because I didn't want to complicate things between us when you've been good enough to be a decent neighbor and a damn fine person to work alongside." He did not look away from her when he said it. "But I'd rather tell you and have it be awkward between us than not tell you, and have you go into another winter thinking I'm just a neighbor who helps with fence posts." Lillian Brooks stood in her own kitchen and felt the stone that had been living against her ribs for 3 years shift slightly, like something trying to find a new position, something adjusting toward a shape that might eventually be comfortable. She was not a woman who fell into things. She was a woman who considered them from every angle and then decided deliberately. "You've known me for 7 weeks," she said. "I know," he said. "And you think you know enough in 7 weeks to say something like that." "Some things you know faster than others," he said. "Some things take longer. I don't know everything about you, Lillian. I know what I've seen and I know what I feel. I'm not asking you to feel the same. I'm just being honest with you because I think you deserve honesty." She was quiet for a long time. He let her be quiet, which was one of the things she had come to value about him, his willingness to give her the space her thoughts required. "I need to think about it," she said finally. "Of course you do," he said, and stood up and took his hat and said good night with the same calm courtesy he always brought to the end of an evening, and went out to where Augustus was tied, and she watched him ride away toward the north section through the kitchen window. She sat down at the table and put her hands flat on the wood and thought for a very long time. She thought about Thomas, which was always the first thing, the anchor point. She thought about him without the immediate anguish that his memory had carried for so long, because time had done what it did, which was not to erase but to transform. Thomas had loved her genuinely, and she had loved him genuinely, and his death had been a wound so deep it had changed the landscape of her interior life permanently. She would always love him, or rather she would always love who he had been and what they had had together. But she had been honest with herself for long enough now to understand that Thomas was gone, and that holding the space where he had been empty forever was not loyalty. It was something else, something she did not have quite the right word for. Fear, perhaps. She thought about what Raymond had said about the fourth winter, and she thought about last winter, the ice on the roof, the dead chickens, the 2 months sleeping by the fire. She thought about the section of her root cellar that had flooded in the spring thaw, and she thought about the fence line on the western edge that was going to need significant work before the ground froze, and she had not yet started it. She thought about all of it with the clear eyes of a woman who had spent 3 years refusing to lie to herself. Then she thought about his hand on her elbow on the roof, the warmth of it, the steadiness of it. She thought about the way he laughed, slow and genuine and surprised out of him sometimes. She thought about the way he had looked at her kitchen, at the shelves she had built herself, not with pity or condescension, but with something that looked very much like admiration. She went to bed without having decided anything, but she slept better than she had in months. In the morning, she rode over to his section without allowing herself to think too much about what she was going to say, because she had found that sometimes the best decisions came from riding toward something rather than sitting still and deliberating about it until you talked yourself out of it. He was splitting wood when she arrived, and he stopped when he saw her coming and set the axe down and waited. She rode right up and swung down from Clover's back and stood in front of him. "You were right," she said. "About the fourth winter. You were right, and I know you were right, and I didn't need to sleep on it to know that. I needed to sleep on the other part." He said nothing. He was good at that. "I am not easy to know," she said. "I want you to understand that before anything else. I have been alone for 3 years, and I have arranged my life around being alone very effectively, and I have strong opinions about how things should be done, and I do not change them easily." "I know," he said. "You say that like you think it's fine," she said. "I say it like I think it's fine because I think it's fine," he said. "I'm not looking for someone easy to know. I've known a great many people who were easy to know, and it was considerably less interesting." She looked at him for a moment, standing there in the autumn morning with wood chips on his shirt, and his hands easy at his sides, and his amber eyes completely steady on her. "I can't tell you that I feel the same way you said you felt last night," she said. "I can't say it because I don't know yet if it's the same or if it's something different. What I can tell you is that I have thought about you a great deal since August, and that the thought of you being my neighbor for a long time does not alarm me the way it might have alarmed me 3 months ago." Something in his face shifted, not a smile exactly, but the thing that happened before a smile. "That might be the most careful declaration of interest I've ever heard," he said. "I am a careful person," she said, and she almost smiled too, almost. "Can I come to dinner on Sunday?" he said. "You can," she said. "And can I help you with the western fence line, because I rode past the edge of it last week and it needs work?" "I know it does," she said. "Yes, you can help with the fence line." She turned and remounted Clover and rode back toward her own land, and she did not look back, but she was almost certain she could feel him watching her go with that particular steady attention. He gave everything that mattered to him. The western fence took 3 days, the two of them working alongside each other with the comfortable efficiency that had developed between them over the summer, and something had shifted in the texture of that working alongside since the conversation in the kitchen. It was nothing overt. They did not suddenly speak of tender things or look at each other with the kind of theatrical longing that people in novels indulged in. But there was a new dimension to the silence between them, something that acknowledged what had been said and what was being carefully, slowly built. On the second evening of the fence work, they sat on the log she used for firewood splitting and drank coffee in the last of the daylight, and he asked her how she had come to be in Wyoming. She told him, and it was the longest she had talked about herself in 3 years. She talked about growing up in Ohio, about meeting Thomas at a church social when she was 22 and he was 24, about the decision to go west because Thomas had a fever for it that she had caught from him, about the drive out in 1875 and the first sight of the territory that had taken her breath clean away despite the fear. She talked about the early years with Thomas, the ones before he got sick, when the homesteading was punishing but shared, when the evenings were lit by two people's laughter and warmth. Raymond listened to all of it. He asked one question carefully when she was done. "Do you still love this land?" She looked out at the sage and the ridgeline and the sky that was going to copper and rose behind the mountains. "More than ever," she said. "That's the strange thing. Everything it's put me through, it's only made me love it more." He nodded. He understood that. She could see that he understood it in a way that only someone who had the same relationship with land could understand. He told her about Kentucky, about the farm his father had worked with a precision that bordered on reverence, about leaving at 16 on the cattle trails because the farm had failed, and there was nothing left to stay for, about 16 years of the trail and the loneliness of it and the hardness of it and the occasional magnificence of it, riding across country so empty and so enormous that you felt simultaneously like nothing and like everything. He told her about the accumulation of years and money and distance from home and how somewhere around age 30 he had started to feel the trail differently, not as freedom but as the particular loneliness of a man who has no stake in any piece of the earth. "You wanted to belong somewhere," she said. "Yes," he said. "That's exactly it." She looked at him in the last of the light. "This is a hard place to belong to," she said. "I know," he said. "I think it might be the right kind of hard." The Sunday dinners became a fixed arrangement. He came every Sunday and occasionally on a Thursday evening as well, when the work had brought them together naturally, and it seemed foolish to ride home and come back. She cooked with more care than she had for herself alone, which she acknowledged to herself without embarrassment, because there was no dishonesty in caring what a person thought of your pot roast. He brought things when he came, a jar of honey he had bartered for in town, or a portion of the venison one of the neighboring families had given him, and he set these contributions down without ceremony, just as his part of the arrangement. The conversations deepened. That was the word for it. They had started with practicalities and moved through histories, and were now in the territory of ideas and opinions, which was where Lillian had been hungry for company without quite knowing it. Thomas had been a good man but not much of a talker, more comfortable with doing than with discussing, and she had loved that about him, but she had also, somewhere underneath that love, been a little starved for the kind of conversation that was not just the exchange of necessary information. Raymond had opinions about everything and was interested in hers. They disagreed on certain things with a vigor that she found unexpectedly enjoyable, about the best method for preserving vegetables, about whether the new barbed wire fencing that was starting to come in from the east was going to change the territory for better or worse, about the fairness of the land office system, and what it meant for the people who had been on this land before any of them. That last topic they agreed on more than she had expected, and it said something about him, she thought, that he could talk about the displacement of the native peoples with clear-eyed acknowledgement of what it had cost them, without sentimentality, but also without the dismissiveness she heard from too many others who preferred not to look at that particular injustice. "My father used to say the law is not always the same thing as what's right," Raymond said one evening. He was talking about something else, but it applies here. Men came in with papers, and the papers said the land was theirs, and the papers were wrong in every way that matters, even if the law said they weren't. "It doesn't make things go back," Lillian said, because she was honest about what could and couldn't be fixed. "No," he said, "it doesn't, but being honest about it matters. It matters for what comes after." She looked at him across the table and felt the thing in her chest that had been shifting and adjusting ever since that October evening move again, settle into something new, something that was beginning to feel less like discomfort and more like homecoming. October moved into November. The sky changed its quality, became that particular flat gray of the pre-winter Wyoming sky that Lillian knew like a second skin by now. She began her winter preparations with the thoroughness of 3 years of hard lessons, but this year there was something different. Raymond was 3 miles north with his own solid structure now, the one he had built with careful hands over the summer, and the knowledge that he was there, that there was someone close enough to reach if the worst came, changed the texture of the preparation in a way she didn't quite have words for. He came to help her stack wood, which she accepted without the internal resistance she would have brought to it the summer before, because she had been honest with herself about the western fence line and the eastern grain storage, and the dozen other things that went faster and better with 2 pairs of hands. They worked through 2 afternoons filling the woodshed to its absolute capacity, and by the time they were done, she felt something close to genuine confidence about the winter ahead, a confidence that was different from the grim determination of the last 3 years, more open and less like armor. On the second afternoon of wood stacking, when they had come inside for coffee and the light had gone the color of old gold through the window, she said something she had been thinking about for several weeks without being quite ready to say it. "Raymond," she said. He looked up from his coffee. "I want you to understand something," she said, "about what I said in October." "All right," he said. "When I said I couldn't tell you if what I felt was the same thing you felt," she said. "I've had some more time to think about it." He was very still, the way he went when he was giving her his full attention. "I think it might be the same thing," she said. "Or close enough to the same thing that the difference probably doesn't matter." She said it with her eyes on him because she was not a woman who said difficult true things while looking at the table. "I thought I should tell you, because you were honest with me and you deserved honest back." Raymond Bancroft put down his coffee cup and looked at her with an expression that she had not seen on him before, not quite, something that was open in a way his face didn't usually show. "Thank you," he said. "Don't make a production of it," she said, because she was Lillian Brooks, and even in moments of vulnerability she maintained certain standards. He almost laughed. She could see it. He contained it, but barely. "Understood," he said. "And I want to be clear that I'm not interested in rushing," she said. "I'm not a rushing person. I've been widowed 3 years and I'm not ashamed of having taken the time to understand what I was feeling, and I don't intend to do anything in a hurry simply because winter is coming and someone made a point about my odds of surviving it. I would never suggest rushing," he said. "I'm not a rushing person either." "Good," she said. They finished their coffee. He rode home in the last of the light. But at the door, for the first time, he reached out and took her hand briefly, just the warmth of his palm against the back of her hand for a moment, a contact that was simple and serious and asked nothing, and gave something nonetheless. She stood on her porch for a long time after he was gone, her hand held slightly away from her side, as if setting it down might end something she wanted to continue. The first snow came the second week of November, which was early but not unprecedented. Lillian had expected it and was ready. She watched it begin from the window with a feeling she had not brought to the first snowfall in 3 years, something that was not the familiar tightening of resolution, but was instead almost peaceful. She was ready, and Raymond was 3 miles north, and she had somehow become a person who found comfort in both of those things without it being a contradiction. He came to check on her 2 days after the first snow, riding through the fresh white with Augustus picking his way carefully, and she fed him lunch and they went through the barn together checking on the 2 cows and the new chickens and Clover, who was showing no signs of the cough this year, which Lillian chose to take as a good sign rather than tempting fate by being too relieved about it. Everything was sound. Everything was as prepared as it could be. "How is your place?" she asked. "Solid," he said. "I'm well stocked and the structure is good. I won't be in any trouble." "You built it soundly," she said, because it was true and she gave credit where it was due. "You helped," he said. The advice about the foundation was important. They walked back from the barn side by side through the snow, and their arms were close enough that their coat sleeves brushed with each step, and neither of them moved away from the contact. December came, and with it, a cold that settled over the territory with the particular purposefulness of a winter that meant business. Lillian maintained her routine with the precision that 3 years had sharpened in her, and Raymond came when he could, which was not every day in the heaviest cold, but was often enough that his absence was noticeable. When he could not come, she could see the smoke from his chimney on clear days from her eastern window, 3 miles of white distance with a thin gray line rising from it, and she had not anticipated how much comfort a chimney smoke could carry. He came on Christmas Day with a small package wrapped in cloth and left his horse in her barn out of the cold, and she had made a proper Christmas dinner with things she had been carefully setting aside for weeks, and they ate together at her small table with a candle lit between them, because it was Christmas, and candles seemed appropriate. He gave her the package after dinner, and it was a book, a collection of poetry by someone she had not read before, and she held it with a care that went beyond the object, because she understood what it meant that he had remembered her mentioning, months ago, that she missed reading more than almost anything else about her life before the West. She had made him something too, a pair of gloves that she had stitched herself from a piece of good leather she had been saving, lined with flannel against the cold. His hands were large, and she had measured them carefully one afternoon when he was working and hadn't noticed her noting the span of his fingers, which she was now slightly embarrassed to think about but also not sorry for, because the gloves fit perfectly. He put them on and flexed his hands in them and looked at her across the table. "These are excellent work," he said. "I know," she said, and they both almost smiled. There was a moment after dinner, when the candle had burned lower and the fire was very warm and the outside world was very cold and very still, when the conversation had gentled into a comfortable quiet, that he reached across the table and put his hand over hers where it lay on the wood. Not the brief contact from the doorway in November, but something deliberate, something that stayed. She turned her hand over under his so that their palms were together, and she held on. It was the first time she had held someone's hand in 3 years, and the warmth of it went up through her arm and into her chest, and she felt the last of the stone against her ribs shift and dissolve into something that was not pain and not absence but simply warmth, simple and genuine and real. "I am glad you came to Wyoming," she said. It was not everything she could have said, but it was true, and it was what she had. "I am glad you were here when I arrived," he said. They sat like that for a long time, the candle burning between them and the fire warm at their backs, and the winter held outside by 4 solid walls, and something between them that had been building since August and was not going to stop now. January was severe. The kind of severe that old-timers in Harlan Creek would talk about for years afterward. The winter of 1881 going into 1882, with temperatures that dropped so far the creek froze solid 8 inches deep, and the snow came in horizontal on wind that had no respect for anything in its path. Lillian worked her routines with the steadiness she had built over years, and Raymond came when the weather permitted, sometimes on horseback and once on foot through a fresh snowfall, because Augustus had developed a shoe problem, and he wasn't going to ride the horse on ice without a proper shoe. He appeared at her door with snow in his hair and on his shoulders, and she pulled him inside without saying anything except, "Coffee is hot." In the deep belly of January, there was a storm that lasted 3 days and kept both of them inside their respective places, unable to travel. Lillian worked through her chores with the efficient calm of someone who had done this before, but she found herself thinking about Raymond in a way that was different from the practical thoughts she was used to thinking about other people's welfare. She found herself wondering what he was doing, specifically, at specific moments of the day, whether he was reading by the fire or fixing something with that methodical patience of his, or whether he had found, as she had, that the enforced stillness of a 3-day storm allowed thoughts to move in directions they didn't always go in the busy hours. On the 4th day, when the storm broke and the world was white and silent and brilliant under a blue sky, he was at her door by mid-morning, and she was genuinely, unguardedly glad to see him in a way that she didn't bother to conceal. 3 days is a long time, he said. It is, she said. He came in and sat at her table, and they talked through most of the day, ranging across everything with the freedom of two people who had found in each other someone they could talk to without reservation. And it occurred to her at some point in the afternoon that she was happy. Not the careful, hard-won contentment that she had cultivated through 3 years of solo survival, but actually happy, the kind that arrived unexpectedly and sat in your chest like warm light. It was unfamiliar enough to be startling, and familiar enough from years before to be recognized. February brought a brief thaw followed by another hard freeze, which was typical of Wyoming winters and which Lillian navigated with expertise. She made a trip to Harlan Creek in the thaw, on a day when the road was passable, to pick up supplies and check the mail. Raymond came with her because he needed things from town as well, and because 12 miles was better navigated in company. The town of Harlan Creek had a way of looking at things and drawing conclusions, as small towns did everywhere and perhaps especially in the West, where everyone's business was somewhat everyone else's survival. She was aware, riding into town beside Raymond on a cold February morning, that they were being observed and noted. She was also aware that she did not particularly mind, which itself was a kind of information. A year ago, even a few months ago, the observation of townsfolk would have made her careful and formal. She was still herself, still composed and direct, but the need to be specifically careful about how she appeared in relation to Raymond Bancroft had quietly ceased to feel necessary. Ezra Potts, who was in town that day for his own supplies, drew her aside at the general store while Raymond was talking to the merchant about a piece of equipment he had ordered. Ezra was old and weathered and direct in the way of old men who had earned the right to be, and he looked at her with his sharp eyes and said, "That Bancroft seems like a good man." "He does," she said. "Good man for this territory," Ezra said. "Knows what he's about and doesn't make a fuss about it." He looked at her steadily. "Thomas would have liked him," he added, and then moved away to look at something on a shelf before she had to respond. She stood for a moment with that ringing in her chest, quiet and clear. Then she picked up her list and went back to shopping. On the ride back, with their supplies loaded and the afternoon light going long and golden over the snow, Raymond said, without preamble in the way he had of saying things that mattered, "Lillian, I want to ask you something." "Then ask," she said. "This spring," he said, "when the ground thaws and things start up again, I'd like to ask you something formal. Something I should have asked sooner, maybe, but I didn't want to ask it in the middle of winter when everything is already difficult." She looked at him. The horses were walking side by side on the road, and the air was cold and bright and clean. "Are you asking me if you can ask me something formal?" she said. He almost laughed again, that contained almost laugh she had become very fond of. "I suppose I am." "You may," she said. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. They rode the rest of the way in a silence that was not empty at all, but full of something that both of them were sitting with carefully. The way you carried something precious across difficult ground. The rest of February and all of March passed with the deliberate slowness of late winter, when the work was steady and the days were short, and the waiting for spring had a particular quality to it. This year, for the first time in 4 years, Lillian found herself genuinely looking forward to the thaw in a way that was about more than the relief of surviving another winter. She was looking forward to something ahead of her rather than just through something behind her, and the difference between those two ways of moving through time was larger than she had words for. The fourth winter had not broken her. It had not even come close, though she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that part of why was the knowledge of Raymond's chimney smoke 3 miles north, and his presence at her table every Sunday, and the particular way this winter had been made less solitary than any of the 3 before it. The snow began melting in earnest in the second week of April, and by the last days of April, the first green was pushing up from the muddy earth of her garden, and the air had the particular sweetness of Wyoming spring, sage and wet earth, and something opening. She was in her kitchen garden one morning, turning the first section of soil with a fork, when she heard Augustus's hooves on the frozen lane and looked up to see Raymond coming with his good hat on instead of his working hat, which she noticed because she noticed everything about him at this point. He tied Augustus and came to where she was working, and she straightened and looked at him. He was holding something, she saw, a small thing that caught the morning light when he turned it, and she felt her heart move. "I told you I was going to ask you something formal in the spring," he said. "I remember," she said. "This is what I have," he said, and held out the small thing, which she could see now was a ring, a plain band with a small dark stone that looked like garnet set simply into the metal. It was not an extravagant thing. It was exactly right. "It was my mother's," he said. "It's the one thing I have left from her. I've been carrying it for 16 years with no idea what I was saving it for, and then I met you." Lillian looked at the ring and then looked at him, at Raymond Bancroft standing in her kitchen garden on an April morning with his good hat and his steady amber eyes and 16 years of a cattle trail and a careful, patient love that had been building since August. And she felt the last of whatever she had been holding back simply release, like a breath held too long. "Yes," she said. She said it without preamble or qualification or conditions. Just yes, clear and clean and final, because she was Lillian Brooks, and when she made a decision, she made it completely. He stepped forward and took her hand and slid the ring onto her finger, and the garnet caught the morning light in a way that seemed almost theatrical, except that it was simply what happened when light met stone, and she was already too full of feeling to be anything but grateful for the extra detail of it. "I want you to know that I understand what you've built here," he said, still holding her hand. "This land is yours. The decisions about it are yours. I'm not asking to take anything from you. I'm asking to be alongside you." She looked up at him, this careful, honest, strong-handed, amber-eyed man who had ridden in on a bay horse in August and had spent 9 months earning the right to be standing in her garden in April, and she understood with absolute clarity that loving Thomas had not been finite, had not used up some fixed quantity of love that was now exhausted. Love was not like wood or grain that could be depleted. It was more like the land itself, capable of growing new things from good soil and enough time. "Alongside is what I want," she said. "That's exactly what I want." He kissed her then, carefully and seriously, the way he did everything, and she kissed him back with the full force of a woman who had decided and meant it. They were married in June of 1882, in the small church in Harlan Creek on a bright Saturday morning, with Ezra Potts standing up beside Raymond because Raymond had no one else to ask, and Ezra was honored and touched in a way he expressed by being gruffer than usual throughout the ceremony. Lillian wore a dress she had made herself from fabric she had ordered specifically, a deep green that she had picked because Thomas had always said it was her color, and she wore it now not as a contradiction of her grief, but as a carrying forward of it, a bringing of her whole history into the new thing she was building. The minister read the vows, and they said them to each other in voices that carried to the back of the small church, and neither of them looked away while saying them, because they were both people who meant what they said and looked at what they meant. Afterward, there was a small gathering at the general store, where the storekeeper's wife had put out cake and coffee, and most of the people of Harlan Creek had managed to find reasons to be present, because a wedding was a genuine occasion in a small settlement, and also because Lillian Brooks surviving 3 winters alone and coming out of it with a husband was a story that the town had a proprietary feeling about. Old Ezra shook Raymond's hand and held it a beat longer than the handshake required. "You're getting the best person in this county," he said. "Don't waste it." "I don't intend to," Raymond said. Raymond moved his belongings from the Henderson section to Lillian's place, though they continued to work his land as well, farming both sections, with a division of effort that made both operations more sustainable than either had been alone. The Henderson land turned out to be good for a different grain variety than Lillian's main crop, which meant a natural diversification that Raymond had spotted early, and that paid off considerably better than either of them had projected in that first summer. Life together was not without friction, because Lillian had been right that she was not an easy person to know, and Raymond had been right that he had known it and thought it was fine. But there were days when her iron will and his methodical patience moved in different directions before finding a way back to the same track. She had strong opinions about the grain storage arrangement. He had strong opinions about the rotation schedule for the western fields. They argued with the directness of two people who did not play games and respected each other enough to say clearly what they thought. And they found compromises not by one yielding to the other, but by the genuine consideration of both positions, until something better than either individual view emerged. In the autumn of 1882, she realized she was expecting their first child, and the feeling that moved through her when she understood what the signs meant was composite and complicated, made of joy and fear and grief for Thomas, who would never know this child, and love for Raymond, who would, and gratitude to the land itself for still being generous, still being something that could grow new things. She told Raymond in the evening, matter-of-factly, sitting at the table after supper, and his face did something she had never seen it do before, opened completely, became for a moment entirely transparent, every wall down. He sat very still for a count of seconds and then got up and came around the table and put his arms around her from behind, carefully, like something he had been wanting to do for a long time and wasn't sure he was allowed, and she felt him press his face briefly into her hair. "All right," he said, against her hair. "All right," she said, and meant it in every possible sense. The pregnancy moved through the winter of 1882 into 1883, and this winter was the first in 5 years where Lillian did not spend significant energy worrying about her survival. She had her preparations and her routines, but she had also Raymond, solidly present, who took on the barn work without being asked during the worst cold, and whose presence transformed the long winter evenings from something to be endured into something that was actually, genuinely pleasant. They read together in the evenings, the book of poetry he had given her and other books that she had sent away for, and sometimes he read aloud to her, because she liked his voice and the quality of his attention when he was reading, careful and thorough, missing nothing. In March of 1883, 3 weeks before she expected, their son arrived during a cold, clear night with the help of the midwife from town who had made the 12-mile trip, and arrived just in time. He was a solid, serious-looking infant who regarded the world from his first moments with dark eyes that would, over the following months, settle into a brown nearly identical to Raymond's amber brown, though they would not be able to confirm this until the spring light was right for it. They named him Thomas Raymond Brooks Bancroft, and she had told Raymond in advance what she wanted the name to be and why, and he had looked at her with the complete understanding she had come to count on from him. "Of course," he had said, "of course we name him Thomas first." Little Thomas, as he came to be called to distinguish him from the memory, was a good-natured and physically robust baby who took to the country air of the Wyoming territory as though it had been specifically designed for him. He grew quickly and confidently, and seemed to have inherited his mother's practicality along with his father's patience, a combination that his parents privately agreed was probably the best possible outcome. Ezra Potts came to see the baby when little Thomas was 2 weeks old, riding over with a piece of smoked ham and an expression of studied unconcern that fooled no one. He held the infant with the competence of a man who had raised children of his own decades ago, and looked down at the dark eyes looking back up at him, and said quietly to Lillian, "Thomas Brooks would be very pleased." She touched Ezra's arm briefly. "I think so too," she said. The years settled into a rhythm that was the particular rhythm of frontier homestead life, its demands and its beauties and its occasional terrible difficulties, but a rhythm now that was shared, shouldered between two people who had each separately learned the full weight of it alone, and who found, in bearing it together, not that it was weightless, but that it was bearable in a way that was closer to joy than mere survival. The summer of 1884 brought a drought that tested every farmer in the territory. Raymond and Lillian worked their 2 sections with everything they had, made difficult decisions about which crops to let go and which to save, and managed to come through with their cattle herd reduced but intact and their grain stores thin but sufficient. It was a hard season, and they were both exhausted and short-tempered on certain evenings. And there was a night in August when they had a genuine argument about the water allocation for the eastern field that went on too long and too hard, and ended in the particular silence of 2 people who have said sharp things and know it. She went to bed before he did that night and lay in the dark listening to the sounds of the cabin, and when he came to bed she was still awake and he knew it because he knew her. "I said things that were unkind," he said from his side of the bed. "You did," she agreed. "So did I. I'm sorry," he said. "I'm sorry too," she said, a beat of quiet. Then she said, "The eastern field rotation, I think you were right about it." "The water allocation, I think you were right about it," he said. Another beat. She could hear the faint, distant cry of a coyote and the breathing of the house around them. "We'll sort it in the morning," she said. "We will," he said. She reached across the dark and found his hand, and they slept. The drought broke in September, and the fall rains came with a generosity that felt like an apology from the sky, and they rebuilt what the summer had depleted with a pragmatic energy that was familiar to both of them by now, the West's essential conversation: take what it throws and build back. In the spring of 1885, their second child arrived, a daughter this time, with Lillian's gray eyes and Raymond's steady constitution, and a temperament that combined her mother's iron will with an unexpected sunniness that seemed to come from somewhere entirely her own. They named her Mary, plain and simple, because they had used up their long names on little Thomas, and Mary was the name both of them had come to independently and told each other within a day of each other, which made the decision easy. Little Thomas was 3 by then, and greeted his sister with the grave seriousness of a person confronted with an important change in their world and deciding to approve of it. He appointed himself her particular guardian within the first week, sitting beside her when Lillian nursed her, touching her small hand with a careful finger that made both parents look at each other over his head with expressions that could not be fully contained. Raymond had finished the expansion of the cabin the previous autumn, adding 2 more rooms to the original structure, in anticipation of what they both understood was going to be a larger family than the original space could comfortably hold. The new rooms were solidly built, as everything Raymond built was solidly built, and Lillian had had strong opinions about their arrangement, and they had argued about the window placement on the east room for nearly an entire afternoon before reaching a solution that was better than either of their original plans, which was becoming a pattern between them that they both privately found satisfying even when it was irritating. Ezra Potts came to see Mary as he had come to see Thomas, with something wrapped in cloth and an expression of studied casualness that still fooled no one. He was slower than he had been, the years working on him as they worked on everyone out here, but his eyes were still sharp, and he still said what he thought, which was one of the things Lillian valued most about him. He held Mary and looked at her, and then looked up at Lillian and Raymond, standing together in the way they stood when they were comfortable, close enough that their arms touched. "You 2 figured it out," he said, with the satisfaction of someone who had been watching a thing resolve as he had hoped it would. "We're still figuring it out," Raymond said. "That's how you know you're doing it right," Ezra said. The following year, 1886, Ezra's health declined significantly through the winter, and Lillian rode over every week through the cold to check on him and bring food and sit with him in the evenings because he had been her steady presence through the hard years, and she was not going to leave him to manage his decline alone. Raymond came with her when the weather allowed, and the 2 of them settled into the habit of carrying Ezra through his final season, with the same practical, unsentimental care that the old man himself had always embodied. Ezra died in February, on a cold, clear night, and they buried him in the spring when the ground allowed it, on his own land as he had wanted, with a marker that Raymond cut from good wood, and Lillian inscribed herself because she had a steady hand, and the words she chose for him were true and specific. She cried at his graveside, the clean, unashamed crying of someone who loved who they had lost and was not interested in pretending otherwise. And Raymond stood beside her with his hand at the small of her back. And when she was done, she wiped her face and took a breath, and they rode home together. Life moved forward in the way that life does, with its layering of seasons and events, its small emergencies and its large joys and its ordinary days that in retrospect reveal themselves to have been the substance of everything. Little Thomas started school in Harlan Creek in 1888, riding the 12 miles each way on a small roan pony that he treated with the same responsible seriousness he brought to everything. Mary, at 3, declared that she intended to go to school immediately and did not understand why she had to wait, which was such a Lillian problem to have with a child that Raymond could barely keep a straight face while negotiating the delay. The territory was changing too, in ways that were visible if you had been watching long enough. The railroad was coming closer. Settlers were arriving in greater numbers, families and ranchers and merchants, and Harlan Creek was growing. New buildings going up on what had been empty lots, a second general store, a school that was better than the one Thomas rode to, a telegraph that connected the town to the world in a way that still struck Lillian as slightly magical even after she had used it several times. The buffalo were largely gone, which was a loss and a change that sat uncomfortably if you let yourself think about it, and what it meant for the people who had been here before all of them. Raymond thought about it and said so, which was one of the reasons she loved him. In the autumn of 1888, Lillian sat on the porch of the cabin on a Sunday evening, with the first stars coming out over the ridge and Mary asleep inside, and Thomas doing his schoolwork at the table, and Raymond beside her in the second chair that he had made the previous winter, because it had taken him 6 years to admit that her single-chair arrangement was not adequate for 2 people who wanted to sit on the porch together. He was a slow man about some things. She looked out at the land, hers and Raymond's now, the 2 sections that they worked together and had built together into something that was producing well and standing solid and promised to keep doing so. She looked at the ridgeline going purple in the last of the light, and the sage catching the wind in long silver waves, and the chimney smoke from their own chimney going straight up in the still evening air. And she thought about the morning she had buried Thomas Brooks in this ground, and the girl she had been at that moment, scared and grieving and standing up straight. And she thought about all the things that had happened between that morning and this evening. Raymond's hand found hers on the arm of her chair without either of them saying anything, their fingers settling together in the habit of years. "What are you thinking?" he asked, because he could read her silences by now, knew which ones wanted company and which wanted space, and this one was the kind that wanted a voice to land in. "I was thinking about the morning I buried Thomas," she said, "and everything since." He waited. "I was thinking that the land was right," she said. "Coming here was right. Even through everything it put me through, it was right." "Yes," he said. "And that I was right to stay," she said. "The winters, I was right to stay through them." "You were," he said, "though I'm glad you didn't have to stay alone through a 4th one." She looked at him in the blue of the evening, at his face that she knew as well as her own now, every line of it, the way the right side of his mouth lifted slightly before the rest of his face caught up with a smile, the way his eyes went soft and direct at the same time when he looked at her, which was every time he looked at her. "So am I," she said. Inside the cabin, Thomas called out a spelling question, and Raymond turned toward the door to answer it, and Mary stirred in her sleep with the small sound that Lillian had long since learned meant she was turning over and not waking. The stars were fully out now over the Wyoming territory, bright and numerous, the way they were on clear autumn nights out here, more stars than a person from the east had ever imagined existed. Lillian sat with her hand in Raymond's and the night around them and the family inside and the land beneath them all, and felt the fullness of it, the specific and irreducible fullness of a life that had cost a great deal and given back considerably more than had been asked for. In the years that followed, the Brooks Bancroft homestead became something of a landmark in the Harlan Creek area, not because anything dramatic happened there, but because it was the kind of place that was simply reliable and solid, the kind of place that other settlers and new arrivals were told to seek out if they needed advice or help or just the reassurance of seeing something that had worked. Lillian's kitchen was rarely empty of a neighbor stopping through, and her knowledge of the land's demands and rhythms was something people sought with the same respect they might bring to a doctor or a minister. Raymond's reputation for being able to build and repair anything on the frontier was well established, and he was frequently consulted and often helped, because he was a man who understood that a community survived by the work of its members for each other. Thomas, at 10, was serious and responsible and deeply interested in the mechanics of farming, shadowing his father through the fields and the barn with the same grave attention he had given everything since he was old enough to give attention. He had his father's patience and his mother's precision, and the combination was formidable in a child, and would be more so in the man he was becoming. Mary, at 5, was her parents' particular delight and occasional exasperation, being possessed of a curiosity that recognized no barriers and a will that was, as Raymond said on more than one occasion with the tone of a man who respected what he was dealing with, absolutely her mother's. She learned to read at 4 and was furious about having to wait for school, and when she finally arrived at school, she organized her classmates within the first week with an efficiency that startled her teacher and surprised no one who had been watching Mary operate in the world. The winter of 1889 was the mildest in memory, and Lillian and Raymond came through it with their stores barely touched, their livestock all well, and their fences intact, which was a gift after a decade of hard ones. Lillian stood on her porch in the March thaw with the first green coming up in the kitchen garden and Raymond beside her drinking coffee, and she felt something that she had been feeling in different forms for years now, the particular satisfaction of a life that had been chosen and worked for and defended, and was continuing to grow in the direction she had hoped for it. "Spring again," Raymond said. "Spring again," she agreed. In the quiet of an April morning in 1891, when Thomas was 13 and Mary was 8, and the Wyoming Territory was becoming the state of Wyoming with all the changes that brought, Lillian discovered she was expecting their third child. She told Raymond at the breakfast table with the same directness she had brought to telling him the first time, and his face did the same thing it had done then, opened completely, all the walls down for a moment before composing itself back into its usual steadiness. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Fine," she said. "Strong." She looked at him. "Good. Good," he said, and reached across the table and took her hand. Their third child, another boy, was born in November of 1891. They named him James Ezra Bancroft, the Ezra for old Ezra Potts, which felt right and was received with the kind of quiet satisfaction that naming a child after someone worthy always carried. James had his mother's gray eyes and his father's broad frame, and a temperament that was somehow sunnier than either of his parents had ever been, more like Mary than either of them, though where Mary's sunshine came with iron underneath it, James's was simply warm, a warmth that seemed to ask nothing of anyone and give itself freely to whoever was present. Little Thomas, at 13, received his new brother with the same gravity he brought to everything important, and within a month had appointed himself a secondary guardian of James as he had been of Mary, though now with the authority of someone who had been doing this for 8 years and considered himself expert at it. Mary was James's absolute favorite person within weeks of his arrival, a preference he expressed by tracking her with his eyes across every room she entered, and by achieving his first genuine laugh in response to something she did when he was 6 weeks old, which delighted Mary so extravagantly that she spent the next week doing the same thing repeatedly. Harlan Creek had grown considerably by then, a proper town with a proper school and a church that had been rebuilt in proper wood after the original frame structure finally gave up, and a telegraph and a newspaper, and all the appurtenances of a place that intended to continue being a place. The land office was still busy, new settlers still arriving, and the conversations in the general store had expanded from purely practical matters to include the state legislature and land rights and the railroad rates, and all the things that happened when a place grew large enough to have politics. Raymond and Lillian participated in the town's life as they participated in everything, practically and honestly. Raymond serving on the committee that negotiated with the railroad about the freight rates that affected every farmer in the area. Lillian organizing the practical response when a family 3 miles south of town lost their cabin to a fire and needed help rebuilding, which was done in 3 working days with the labor of 20 neighbors and the coordination of one Lillian Bancroft, who made the organizational charts and the supply lists and the meal arrangements with the efficient calm of someone who had spent over a decade making sure things worked. The years gathered themselves into a life, and it was a good life, a genuinely good life in the specific and particular way that good lives are good, not free of difficulty or loss or the inevitable friction of real things, but rich in the things that matter and anchored in the things that last. The land was good. The work was meaningful. The children were growing into people that their parents could respect as well as love. And Raymond and Lillian Bancroft, in the evenings when the work was done and the children were settled and the stars came out over the Wyoming sky, continued to find in each other the thing they had each, separately, been going without for too long and had finally, by the particular grace of an August morning and a bay horse and an honest man's honest words, found. On a September evening in 1893, Lillian sat at the table she had sat at through the whole of her life in this place, the table where Thomas Brooks had read from the almanac, and where she had written out her survival lists, and where Raymond Bancroft had drunk coffee the first morning she invited him in, and she wrote a letter to her sister in Missouri. Her sister had been asking for years for news, real news, and Lillian, who was not a woman who wrote about her feelings because she had always found it easier to feel them than to describe them, found herself writing something she had not entirely planned to write. She wrote about Thomas, the first Thomas, with the clarity and love and settled grief of someone who had learned how to carry a loss without being crushed by it. She wrote about the winters, the 3 hard winters alone, the loneliness and the fear and the stubborn determination that had gotten her through them. She wrote about the morning Raymond arrived on Augustus and the slow, careful, honest way that everything had changed. She wrote about little Thomas and Mary and baby James, who was 2 now, and had taken to following the chickens around the yard with a focus that suggested he was planning something. She wrote finally this, that she had thought for a long time that surviving was enough, that getting through was the whole of what she could expect or hope for, that the winters had taught her the limits of what one person could bear alone, and that she had assumed bearing it alone was the only option available. She wrote that she had been wrong about that, not about the survival or the winters or the limits. All of that had been real and she stood behind every minute of it, but wrong about alone. Wrong about it being the permanent condition, wrong about the stone against her ribs. She folded the letter and addressed it and set it on the sideboard to go to town next time Raymond went, and then she sat for a moment in the autumn evening quiet, listening to the sounds of the house around her. James's even breathing from his room. The faint sound of Mary's voice, talking to herself the way she did when she was reading, narrating the story under her breath. Thomas's footsteps across the boards overhead, solid and careful. Outside, the wind in the sage, and the last of the light going off the ridge. Raymond came in from the barn, the door letting in a breath of cool air and the smell of hay, and he set his hat on the hook and washed his hands at the basin and came to where she was sitting with the particular quality of ease that was his domestic signature, the ease of a man in the right place. "Letter done," he said, seeing the folded paper on the sideboard. "Done," she said. He sat across from her, as he had sat 1,000 times, at this table that had been the center of this life through all its iterations, and looked at her with the straightforward warmth that had never changed from the first time it had been aimed at her across this same table over a cup of coffee in August of 1881. "Good day," he said. She considered the question with her usual honesty. The cows were well. The harvest was good. The children were whole. The man across from her was the same man who had stood in her kitchen garden and slid his mother's garnet ring onto her finger and promised to be alongside her, and had been every day since in every possible way. "A very good day," she said. And she meant it, completely and without qualification, the way Lillian Brooks had always meant everything she said, and the way she intended to keep on meaning things for as many more years as the Wyoming Territory, and the man across the table and her own iron-built, love-softened heart could possibly provide. The evening settled around them, warm and certain, and outside the first star appeared over the ridge, and inside the fire was bright, and in the rooms beyond the children were present and safe and real, and Lillian Bancroft sat at her table in her home on her land and was, after everything, entirely where she was supposed to be.